And it's that time.
Tech Talk and Chat Live with Layer 7.
Welcome everybody to the Layer 7's Tech Talk.
Join the conversation.
This is a live chat. This is not scripted, and it's fully open, so we hope to hear from you guys.
We're going to take your questions through the feed, through Facebook and through Twitter.
Tech Talk for developers, engineers, and architects.
Simon asks, what are your thoughts on JWT JSON web tokens?
That's a very good question.
No matter where you are, Layer 7 is ready to answer your questions live.
San Marcos, California. This one's from Chicago. We've got another question from the UK, so we're going all around the world.
Don't miss Tech Talk Tuesdays, live on Facebook every other Tuesday. Brought to you by Layer 7 Technologies.
Hey everybody. You can see people are still starting to check in. Just want to welcome everybody to another Tech Talk. I've got Scott Morrison again, our CTO. And today we're going to talk Swagger. Sorry, I'm just going to mute the sound. Swagger, WADL, and some API stuff as well. But mostly WADL and Swagger. And yeah, just let Scott sort of introduce the topic, and we'll, like I always try to remind everybody to get your questions formulated. It's easy to just check in, click the red button, and just fire off some questions. You can do it through Twitter as well at hashtag Layer7Live. Yeah, and just we anticipate having a good kind of interactive Q&A talking Swagger and WADL. So Scott, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, listen, Stephen, this is a good one. I'm looking forward to it, actually, because it's got a lot of controversy in it. Nothing divides developers like an IDL. Do you need them? Do you not need them? And hopefully we'll answer a couple of those questions as we go along today. There's no, truth be told, there's no good answer. Your mileage is going to vary on this one, but hopefully we'll be able to steer you towards one direction or the other.
Okay. So let's see, let's have a quick look here. We've got, I'm 17, hotshot coder, and I can code you into the ground.
It's probably true.
Well, I'm not. I mean, obviously I'm not. Why the hell do I need a formal API description? I just read the webpage.
Listen, good. Good question. You know what, it's true. In a lot of the reason we moved towards, RESTful design and APIs and things like that was to get away from the formality, and this kind of rigid, boxed-in thinking of we absolutely have to have everything defined down to the nth degree. And in fact, you have to have libraries, you have to have complex IDEs that auto-generate code and all this kind of crap. Here's the honest truth, guys. Nobody's ever should force you into doing one of these things, like in using any kind of code gen, in using any kind of formalized API description. Part of the beauty of REST, actually, is you can delay all that. You can quite literally, grab and copy and paste a code snippet and use your browser, as a means of doing some kind of rudimentary testing. Copy and paste a get into the address bar. If you need posts and things like that, use REST client or something like that. The nice thing about it, though, is that there is a continuum up here. You can begin to up-level into formality as you need it, because there's always going to be a kind of application where you need to think more about the life cycle and supporting the life cycle of some kind of API over a long period of time. And in particular, you may need to think about versioning. You may need to think about actually being able to create an API for other people to consume that you may be able to test with automated tools and things like that. And so if I leave you with anything at the end of this, there is no perfect answer, really. You kind of have to find yourself along that continuum. The beauty, though, is that there is a continuum for the first time. There wasn't one before. If you look at what we've done in the past, whether it's the dark days of Corba and, Com Plus and things like that, where it was very formalized and rigid, there wasn't a quick and easy way of doing it, which is really what we have with informal REST. And so the fact that we can choose where we are, we can dial it up or dial it down, I think is actually one of the strengths of kind of this new model of how we're doing APIs. And so that's actually a good thing.
Okay. Just another reminder to check into chat. We see we've got lots of viewers, so you're welcome to just watch as well and listen. But it'd be great if you had a question and just to send it through the chat or through Twitter. And here's another question from Matt. Why hasn't WADL taken off as much as WSDL? Is it limited, or is it too much of a cultural mismatch for the API development world?
Ooh, that's a great question actually. Part of it is WADL took off because it was absolutely necessary to the tooling, not because it was a great spec. In fact, it was a bloody awful spec. In fact, I think in a lot of ways it was an abomination. I mean, WADL was really hard. I don't know how many times I had to go back and look at the details of WADL and try to figure out just what the hell's going on in this thing. It was not made for the humans, and that's a problem. It was made for the tooling. And like a lot of the things in the bad old days of classic web services, it was very over-designed to deal with a lot of boundary problems and that. But nevertheless, it took off because it was integral to a lot of tooling. You got it for free. Like if you look at any of the big IDE systems, like Visual Studio, or even if you're working within Java, you can almost always auto-generate from a bunch of objects. You can auto-generate, a WADL and very easily publish a particular series of objects as a web service. So you kind of got it for free. So a lot of its popularity was simply because it was built into that stuff. In contrast, if you go over to the RESTful design world, life is a little different. I mean, really what we tend to do is we lean much more towards an informal description on a web page or something like that, where you can quite literally just prototype things, copy and paste them. And completely avoid that step of having to worry about expensive tooling and IDEs that link you into a particular model of development. And that suddenly Notepad really is good enough to do really, really good scalable development. So arguably, the thing about WADL is it sort of fell in the middle. Like it kind of came because it made sense, but it wasn't necessarily needed. So in the early days of REST, really we jumped to the other side. We went to the complete informality. And in a lot of ways, WADL kind of got bypassed. So if you'd asked me 24 months ago or something and said, WADL, what do you think? I would have said, dead, DOA, gone, you're never going to see the thing again. But truth be told, it's actually kind of come back. And it's come back for some very good reasons, which I think we're going to get to as we go through this.
Okay. Jamie asks, there are lots of methods for documenting APIs put out there by independent startups. Does the market need to consolidate, or is it okay to have many competing options?
Well, yeah, you know what? I mean, I think the beauty of this industry is that it is about competition. And I think the cream will rise to the top. And the stuff that the community decides makes sense will be the one that wins. In this modern world, you don't get VHS and Betamax wars quite as much in the sense that corporate interests force one thing over the other. I think in the modern world, I'm talking about the last couple of years, where I think developers have, and the community itself has gained a lot more power than it had maybe even 5 years ago. I think the community drives what works well now. So I don't mind. And I think it's a good thing that there's a lot of different hats being thrown into the ring, whether it's WADL, whether it's the stuff that's coming out in Swagger, whether it's the approach that Google has with its API Explorer and API discovery systems and that. And I'm sure there's other ones that people are working on now, because every one of these has perspectives, differences of opinion, limitations, things they do really well. So I mean, I think what's going to happen is people will gravitate towards the tools that help them out. That's the big difference, because in the past, we had vendors coming in and saying, this is what you're going to do, this is what we're going to build our entire infrastructure around, and there was lots of pulling of hair and gnashing of teeth at standards committees and all of this, and years later, tooling would appear, and it was all really frustrating. Now the modern world tends to be much more really driven around problems being solved, and that's a great thing, I think, because if you look at everything that's coming out with the whole API movement. If you look at stuff like JSON, appearing, if you look at things like OAuth appearing as a means to solving problems in the grassroots, I mean, I think that's the theme of the modern world, and I think that's a really good thing. It's by developers for developers, and the good solutions are the solutions that we all use and need, not because somebody's telling us to use these, but because in fact they actually solve a real problem. And so I think we will see that. I think we will see one or two, solutions really being the thing that wins. Which ones those are going to be? I don't want to tell you the truth. I don't want to place a bet right now. honestly don't know, because it is a bit of the Wild West. And I don't think the last part of the story has been told on that one yet. I think we're still waiting it out.
Okay. So follow-up question from Jamie too. Okay, you got me hooked. Tell me about Swagger.
Okay. Well, Swagger's interesting because it came out last summer, and you know it's intriguing because it actually again came out of real developers solving real problems, and really when you think about it, in the past we had all of these standards like WASDL and like WADL and things like that, which were fundamentally about the IDL, like in other words, the interface description language, this way of saying, you know, here's the parameters going in, here are the methods you can call, here's the, you know, the object model coming out. And it sort of defines it in a very classic way. The cool thing about Swagger is it's not really about that low-level definition of exactly how an IDL should be. It's about a solution. And I think that's a really good thing. And the solution encompasses a few things. It's about, number one, on the server side, building annotations, you know, so you can actually describe what an API looks like. And on the server side, there's, you know, it very deliberately doesn't tie itself to any particular language. I mean, the philosophy is that if I'm a client-side developer, I shouldn't care what's on the server side. I mean, it could be Java, it could be JavaScript, it could be, you know, Scala or whatever. It doesn't matter to me. Okay, I just really care about fundamentally how do I call this thing, you know, in a good RESTful style. So it comes up with you know, a way of using, especially in the Java case, annotations to kind of formalize the description in such a way that it leverages what's already there within a language, much in the same way, let's say, that Java doc did, so that you could auto-generate, you know, beautiful documentation that looks good. You know, Java doc was a genius thing when you think about it. We didn't have anything like that before. It was just integral to the language that you could just, you know, in a very deterministic way, just barf out all these pages that describe what, you know, in this case, a Java API looked like. So it really adds right there. And of course, you know, it hasn't tried to say it only works in Java or anything like that. You know, there's an implementation in Node as well, which is really, really cool. There's an implementation in Scala. And there's no limitations that say you can't do it for, you know, Ruby or anything like that, or PHP. The other half of it, of course, is basically a sandbox system or an API explorer, which really is both a discovery model. So it's like basically a little web app that allows you to kind of go to the root of a bunch of APIs and, you know, go through, discover what's there. And in particular, discover what's there subject to your entitlements. So it's not just that everybody sees everything. It's you see what your API key is entitled to see. So I may get to see absolutely everything. Stephen may get to see this much. You know, somebody else, Jamie, may only get to see this tiny little bit right here. And that's actually really cool because it starts to think about this whole thing about authorization, which, you know, really isn't dealt with in a lot of the other solutions. It of course gives you the Explorer sort of model where you can try things out. You can parameterize all of the, you know, the different queries and, you know, kick the tires, you know, so to speak, see what comes back, which is actually really, really important because it you know, lowers the barrier to entry. You can just, you know, experiment, understand before you codify it into IDEs and things like that, or whatever you happen to be working with. And the third part of it is really, you know, auto-generation of client stubs and that within a language that you might be using. So again, you know, JavaScript, you know, PHP, ActionScript, you know, what have you. And again, no limitations on that. You could certainly, you know, extend it to emit other stuff. And people have extended it to work within, you know, Spring MVC and stuff like that as well. So I think it's cool because it's not just saying, here's an IDL, it's a new one, you know, it's different from the last ones. You know, this one's great because it deals with JSON and XML, you know, as opposed to some other ones. But it says this is a big solution, and it sort of deals with everything soup to nuts. So I think that's cool. I mean, I think it's the right solution at the right time.
Cool. We've got a couple questions. I hope I can get them right because sometimes they get fragmented on Twitter. But David asks, can you discuss WADL versus code lifecycles? Generating WADL from code, Java, Spring, annotations, etc., in order to keep them in sync.
Ooh, that's, you know, that's a very good question, and that's, you know, when I kind of opened this up, I said, at the beginning, the thing you got to think about is right sizing for your problem. And for a lot of people, depending on the scope and scale of the problem, in particular, is it a very closed system, or is it a very, a system that's going to evolve a lot on the server side, and you have to try to keep that in sync with and versions in sync with lots of different client developers. That's when you start to lean towards, these kinds of formalized IDLs and descriptions and things. Because you need a central, sort of place where you sync up on something that's very absolute. You need that determinism all of a sudden. I think in the case of trying to keep that IDL, whether it's WADL or even WADL 2 for that matter, for doing RESTful APIs. No bias there, but you still do have that problem of keeping your actual server-side code in sync. And the key thing behind that is you have to sort of treat that extra piece of metadata associated, that artifact that comes out, it's emitted from your server-side code, basically versioned and in sync, with the rest of your app. So treat it as metadata the same way you treat, other artifacts like deployment descriptors, and files, all of this kind of stuff. Keep all of that together. Make sure it gets versioned, along with, all the rest of your code. Because you don't want to sort of be doing it on the fly, obviously, and you need that closure of all the metadata plus the code plus everything that you need, the whole sort of enchilada that makes up a server-side application. And unfortunately, that tends to be fairly manual. I mean, there's always going to be a point where you sort of have to say, generate. I also see a lot, and this is true, of people kind of rolling their own, sort of disconnected from the code. That can be a problem simply because people make mistakes, and very often you might make a quick change and it's great. This is an underlying change in my underlying implementation. I've just made some changes to this low-level class down here. It's not going to reflect on any of my parameterization in the API. But maybe you're wrong, and and you forget to, or you neglect to update your IDL. That can be a bit of a problem. So as much as possible, if you can auto-generate, do it. If you can use annotations and stuff, do it. Because machines tend to at least be a little more deterministic this way. But definitely, you got to keep that stuff in sync, or you're into a world of hurt.
Okay, so David, I hope that answers your question. You kind of have a second part on Twitter that I'm not exactly sure if Scott touched on it or not, which seems to ignore the tooling uses of WADL, such as client ID support.
Yeah, there's some okay tooling for generating that.
Okay.
Not as much as there should be. Not as much as there should be. I mean, the WADL philosophy, when it first came out, remember, it came out of Sun a long time ago. It was sort of a recognition, by a couple of people at Sun that there needed to be some kind of, formalization of REST. They were sort of looking forward to the day when it wouldn't, just be, let's all kind of, document everything with web pages. There would be some kinds of applications where you would need the formalism. And that, but it was quite a long time ago. Like, it was pre-JSON and things like that, which is why, it didn't acknowledge JSON schemas and stuff like that, and you have to kind of hack your way around that. But the philosophy was that if you build it, they will come, and people will create auto-generation, within IDEs like Eclipse and things like that. Truth be told, it lost a lot of momentum in the intervening years, which is sort of unfortunate because the tooling didn't follow. And the nice thing about Swagger was that it sort of, I think it learned from that, in that it said, if we just do, let's say, a WADL that uses JSON, as an underlying representation instead, and that's going to be where we stop and hope everybody builds stuff on top of that. It might have gotten a little better, like maybe a little more uptake, but it wouldn't really have solved the problem. What was smart about what they did is that it really was a little more soup to nuts. They created a solution instead of just a point technology, hoping people would build on it. You can build on it; nothing to stop you from it. But that, WADL does suffer from that for sure. It's just, it's like I said before. If you'd asked me 24 months ago or something, I'd say WADL, yet another four-letter acronym or initialism that's disappeared. But it has come back a lot, and it has come back a lot because people want sandboxes, because people want to build API explorers and things like that.
Okay, so David, I hope that answers your question. If not, just make sure to, sort of maybe clarify it through the chat, and we'll readdress it, no problem. I also want to welcome Hussein back. I remember you were here a couple of tech talks ago. I can't remember exactly which one, but you had some really good questions, so don't be shy. Scott's here to answer any questions, or even if you have any comments. And another question from Matt. Have you seen any good tools or methods for auto-discovering APIs or API descriptions?
Oh, yeah, that is a good one, actually. That's the thing that Swagger did really well, really, really well, is that there always was sort of a route that, like a discovery page, that would, go through and kind of reveal, based on, your credentials, your API key, what you were allowed to see. So it's important to have that first route. Once you get that initial page and get the listing, you can begin to navigate down through there. Web services kind of had something like that. And oh wow, I've totally drawn a blank. It's maybe I'm trying to forget. And it was one of those things that never really took off. But it was a really neat, because I know we implemented it on the secure span gateways, like in the very early days at layer 7. It was just basically a very, very simple XML representation that said, here's the list of basic services, and you kind of go down through there, but eventually you'd end up with WADL.
We've got Jamie and Francois both say WSIL.
That's it, WSIL, and thank you, Francois.
Thanks, guys.
Because Francois actually is a good friend of mine, and he actually has implemented it. He suffered through the WSIL days and stuff like that, and to this day you can go to a secure span gateway and find that route, that WSIL route. But anyway, it's good because you need somewhere to start, and then once you're there, you can actually use the browser and use the fact that you can, in a sense, have a website that guides you through things. So again, the beauty of Swagger is that it recognized that you sort of need that. Google did the same. They had their API discovery service, which if you can Google for, and it focuses again on their stuff, like their APIs, but there is a route there, and from there you can begin to go down and discover the APIs. You've got a sandbox. And an Explorer where you can start to, once you find the one you like the stock quote service or something like that, then you can go in and play with the parameterization. You can say, well, what if I put, a particular stock quote, I want to quote for IBM. Oh, it's gone down today. What if you do something like that? What do you get back? Like, what's the information look like? So again, it exists within I guess the namespace, the URL space of that, the root of that particular discovery point. So Swagger did a great job of that. I think the API Explorer, from Google, did a good job of that. I think that's raised the bar. That sort of set the standard of where you're going to be. WADL, of course, is really just fundamentally about defining the IDL, if you will, of the RESTful service. So it says, here's what it looks like, here's where it is, here's what you put in, here's the model, that you can get back, mostly in XML. You can't hack it and extend it for JSON. People have been doing that with JSON schema, and but it doesn't really kind of give you that extra layer of organization. So that part of discovery I think is important because it does fit into the modern world too. Like, when I think about it, I look at the bad old days of big web services where we tried to build these big registries and repositories, and we tried to graft all this formalism and infrastructure and stuff like that onto developers. So you have to use this big expensive tool, and it forces you down this way. And the problem is that it wasn't really solving the problem. I mean, the problem was pretty simple. It was discovery, experimentation, just getting distributed computing done. It created an end in itself, and all of this difficult and complex infrastructure around it. When you think about it, really, the reason the API movement has just taken off to such an extent, where the WS star world and classical SOAP arguably didn't, was because it's easy, because it leans towards the tools that people gravitate towards naturally. Documentation using wiki or blogs or whatever. Just the tools that nobody tells us we have to use, we use because we want to use them. Discovery through search, things like Google. imagine that. Like, why didn't somebody think of that before? It's so bloody obvious. But that's the neat thing, is that discovery using the tools that are natural, using the tools that we gravitate towards, as opposed to, some buyer saying, well, we bought this thing for you and now you have to use it. That's the way modern development works.
Oh, another question. How did you feel about third-party documentation of open APIs? Recognizing that it's no longer a living document and there could be a mismatch with the actual API.
Yeah, that can be a problem. And again, that speaks exactly to the formalization of trying to keep the documentation as deterministically generated from the code as possible. Again, go back to Java and the genius of JavaScript. The reason JavaScript was so great is that at its simplest level, you could just start to write some classes and it would just auto-generate in the same format everywhere. It didn't matter whether you worked for Sun or you were just hacking code in your basement. It all looked the same. And you know what? That uniformity is great, and you got it for free. Then if you wanted to augment it, you augmented it with the code. And so it tracked with the code. So it made a tremendous amount of sense. It basically made it effortless to document as you go along. And I think that was a really good model. The problem with the disconnection of the very informal approach of well, you know what, we're going to write over here, but then we're going to do documentation over here, and we're going to split these two things apart, is that it loses that. Because again, you can start to get into tracking problems, and you have to be extremely disciplined in terms of how you keep those two things together. Should you not do that? No, of course not, because sometimes you just have to do that for various reasons. The truth is, if you can move towards a place where you can begin to, keep your actual annotations and stuff with the code so that it goes through the whole software development lifecycle and the versioning and everything like that, you get that closure between doc and code so the two are, linked together and kept in sync. That's a really great thing, and that's the argument for a lot of these, sort of newer approaches like Swagger and things like that, which sort of recognize that. They recognize that there were some good things in what came out of JavaScript, or sort of, the Java model, which has been adopted by a lot of other languages, and doing something very similar in the API world. We get that tight integration between doc and code.
Cool. David has another kind of a follow-up question, I think, and again, it's a little bit hard to, I think, any L18N support, you might have to read this little bit of code here.
Oh, internationalization.
Internet support for WADL, like doc, XML, lang equals elements, specifically tooling that allows merging external localization.
Ooh, wow. Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. I mean, that's, to be honest, that's the nice thing about, an XML-based IDL. As much as XML can be tremendously frustrating because it just got too bloated and it had too much stuff in it. It did solve some really good problems in terms of internationalization, Unicode support, and things like that. That is an area that absolutely it makes sense to be, kind of leaning towards some of these original formalized methods, because, you don't get that in a lot of other approaches. That's an excellent question, actually.
Okay, so I've got what did people do in the olden days to describe web services? You may have sort of.
You see, you're talking about my gray hairs.
Hey, Grandpa.
Yeah. That's right. But I tell you, in the olden days, we used to have to write. We used clay tablets. We did cards in cuneiform, and we'd walk 100 miles to the IBM mainframe. It was uphill both ways. Yeah, you know what? That is it. Like in the olden days, 5 years ago, we really did focus mainly on things like WADL and that. And if it was ever easy, it was easy because it was integral to the IDEs and that. And you just got it for free. You didn't have to think about it. Okay. If you didn't have that, you were in for a world of hurt. And that was the thing that was tough for us, because if you had to start to really think about all those boundary conditions of WADL and things like that, it was ugly. And indeed, the original WADL is still to this day is got the widest support. Didn't support RESTful services. It wasn't until WASL 2 came out, that they started to acknowledge gets and things like that. But it really always felt like a bolt-on. Like I'll be perfectly honest with you. I've never used WASL 2 to do any kind of IDL for a RESTful service. I just think it's too complex and difficult and generally pretty ugly. I will always lean towards some of the newer approaches, whether it's WADL or whether it's things like Swagger or whether it's the next thing that's coming down the line. The old days were tough, just like your grandfather will always tell you. But I think in a lot of ways they were tough because they were so defined by vendors. And I say that as a vendor. I mean, these specs and the complexity of these specs didn't do us any favors. I think the reason many pieces of tooling exist is just to deal with the complexities of many of the specifications of those days. I think what's nice about what's going on today in the modern development world is that it moves beyond that. It embraces I think the goals of open source, which were to make things accessible, and accessibility isn't just about making things free and usable and having a license that's compatible with building things. It's also about really making things accessible and creating lower barriers to entry. And I think the acknowledgement of the 80-20 rule, and that maybe we didn't need all that complexity and all those boundary conditions after all, because most of what we had to solve was actually just that 80%, that was actually fairly simple. Let's just use that, go with that. Yes, there's going to be problems here and there. Maybe when we get into internationalization, as pointed out, or maybe other areas. But for most of what I need to do, I'm good to go, and I can just run with it. I think that's a lot of the the zeitgeist of the times, and frankly, that excites me. And even as a vendor, that excites me because I think it means we can get things done and just move on. Also, there's a great I'll tell you a story. This is a true story of an app I did a bunch of years ago. This is probably 6 or 7 years ago. Was torture testing some libraries and some hardware and things like that. And I whipped it together, and I was doing it really fast, and I needed to have some parameterization of properties and things like that. And so I said, okay, great, I'll do this in XML and everything like that. But I was in a hurry, and my focus was on the app. It wasn't on building the properties and that. So I thought, oh God, I gotta I'm a little rusty these days. I haven't been doing a lot of coding. I don't want to sort of refresh my memory about how to bring in this XML library and deal with it. You know what I'm just going to do? I'll call a file properties.xml, but I'm just going to throw in some quick name value pairs and I'll sub it in XML later. And because I was in a hurry to solve the real problem at hand, okay, which is building this testing scaffolding to torture test this particular piece of hardware. And then eventually it got distributed to other people and that, and I never actually put the XML in. And somebody eventually came back to me and said, your XML isn't really XML. I said, oh yeah, God, I completely forgot about that. But I think it underlies the point, which was, the right way to do it at that time was, of course, to build my properties in XML and everything like that. But maybe the right thing to do was really just to focus on the problem at hand and do what was easy, and do what just was right sized for the problem. And so I kind of did that, and I skipped over it. And when I look back on that, I always think about that because it reminds me that sometimes what what everybody says is, oh, you got to do this and add this complexity and everything like that, isn't necessarily what you need. And you should be focusing 100% on the problem that has to be solved. And there are easy ways of solving that just sort of fit with the times. Don't worry about the technology for technology's sake. Worry about solving the cool problem that you've got to solve in front of you. So.
Okay. Looks like we've kind of got the same question in two different versions from Matt and Jamie. So I'll read off Matt's. WS covered a lot of ground, mainly security. Have you seen any good ways of incorporating security markup, for example, OAuth, into API descriptions?
Oh, the policy thing again. I'll sometimes argue that the reason Layer 7 exists is because of the problem of describing policy, which is largely security, but could be a lot of other things as well. The WS star approach did a lot around the whole idea of formalizing how we describe security policy. There's WS policy framework plus WS security policy and everything like that. But again, it was very, very complex. Did a lot of good things, believe me. But it was, the tooling again lagged the standards in that, and when it finally did come up, it was tended to be very proprietary, difficult to use, blah 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 blah. We're there again though, and arguably none of these things really deal with a lot of the subtleties of how you start to describe, associated with an IDL policy for access into them. I mean, I think the Swagger guys did some interesting things in that they've got annotations that can hook into, security filters and stuff. Which if you're a Java, coder, you can certainly override and deal with. But it doesn't go into a lot of detail about how you'd annotate, something like, I think, like as Matt mentions, an OAuth interaction, because there's a lot of, there's usually a couple of parties involved in that, especially if it's like three-legged OAuth. Similarly, if you're, do you use API keys as opposed to username and password? How would you distinguish the old Twitter API versus the new Twitter API using OAuth? How would you, how do you start to deal with, let's say versions of OAuth or something like that? So there's a lot of this stuff. As things like OpenID Connect begin to take off, and we start to actually do more queries against things like attributes and that associated with people. This is really these things are going to come home to roost. At present, this is an open issue, guys. There is a huge disconnection here. Like I say, Swagger got close to it in that they've got this idea of authorization. So, I may get to see all of the APIs based on my API key. Stephen may only get to see this many, and so on and so on.
So does Swagger make your life better or easier?
It does, and then again, it's a solution. Like it's the complete, it's the complete solution in all parts, which I think, makes life a little easier there. But it doesn't solve that problem. That is still absolutely an open problem. Now, can people build that on Swagger? Yes. Can people build that on WADL? Absolutely. There are approaches to starting to do this. I mean, part of the beauty, of course, of the RESTful method, again, is that it uses the web architecture. I mean, you don't have to go through and whereas in WS security, for instance, we had, very complex approaches to doing message-based security. There's a time and a place for that. I've got customers that absolutely use that, not because they think it's cool, because they need that. They've got messages that go over multiple hops, get persisted to disk, might even get printed out on a piece of paper. Security context has to follow that piece of information. There is a reason for all of that stuff. But truth be told, 80-20 rule again, for a lot of what we're building today, we don't necessarily need that, and channel-based security is good enough. And just that little S on the end of HTTP solves a whole host of problems and makes a lot of security a lot easier. But as you get into security tokens, which are like you run the gamut from a username and a password, to an OAuth access token, even arguably a refresh token, to an API key, all of this kind of stuff. How you articulate that kind of stuff. This is an open area, so if you're out there looking for something to make an impact on, I would seriously think about working on that area, because people are going to need it.
So, was there anything wrong with WSDL, or didn't it describe RESTful services as well?
It did, but it did within the WSDL complexity and difficulty. You read it, you start thinking, port type, what the hell is a port? Oh God, it just, your eyes roll into the back of your head. It wasn't for humans. It was for machines. WADL was more for humans, but it was still in the XML world, and that, arguably was ahead of its time, and that, some of the other, more JSON, based approaches are extremely human readable, and bind, naturally into, obviously JavaScript, but the binding into other languages is incredibly easy. Whereas JAXB and stuff like that, not so much.
So who uses WADL today then?
Oh, lots of people. Layer 7 uses WADL. So again, remember when I said earlier, if you'd asked me 24 months ago, I'd say, yeah, it's kind of come and gone. But it's absolutely come back for the reason we need there are times when you need a formal approach. Here at Layer 7, we used WADL is the basis of our API Explorer, our sandbox tooling, which comes with our API portal. We needed a way of going from an API, that's published on one of our gateways, to formalizing that description so that you've, through our API Explorer, you can bang against it, you can try it out, you can explore, how to actually use that. And that's an integral piece of technology within our API portal. It's very, very cool. Again, from there you can auto-generate documentation, in a way that's very, very similar to, what we've done with other annotations. The problem, of course, is WADL has to expand to deal with certain things like, default parameters and other kinds of hints and things like that, other snippets for documentation. I mean, that's where XML is actually quite a great thing in that it's very easy to extend. I mean, that's the X in XML. And we're not the only ones. Other companies, who are also very, very active in the API space. Apogee, for instance, they've done some very good work again in putting additional namespaces within WADL to extend for their own API Explorer, and they've thrown this kind of stuff out into open source. It's available for everybody. So I think that's the second coming of what was a great piece of work in the first place.
Great. So just another reminder to keep your questions coming. I see people are coming and going, and like I said, I know a lot of people just kind of want to listen or watch, but don't be shy. Throw out your questions, and I see people sort of coming in a little bit later, so don't be afraid to ask a question. We may have touched on it earlier when you weren't here, but Scott's here for another 10, 15 minutes, so just make sure answer your questions while you can. Otherwise, we can follow up offline afterwards. But so another question from Jamie. Shouldn't the goal of any API Explorer be generation of sample code in various languages and test harnesses?
Yes, yeah, and that's, well, okay, here, maybe I should say it depends. Because there's certain developers, certain client-side developers, who will say, over my dead body, I never want to do that. I just want to, basically hack the rest together because I want visibility into it. I want to tune all the parameters and that. And I say there's no problem with that. I mean, go ahead, fill your boots. If that fits your model, do that. Don't let anybody tell you it's the worst thing possible, because we've all done it before. Let's face it. I mean, that's again part of the beauty of REST is that cut and paste from either the address bar or part of REST client or the API Explorer or something like that, and then going in and parameterizing that as a string, quite literally. I mean, you can it's a good fast way of getting stuff done. But that said, there's also there's a place for just thinking in objects, okay, whether you're thinking in JavaScript or you're thinking in Java or you're thinking in whatever your poison might be, and you don't worry about the wire protocol at all, because in the end, ultimately, the RESTful architectural style still does come out to a wire protocol. And you can argue that anybody writing web pages doesn't think too much about the wire protocol until they really have to. I mean, they abstract away by thinking of forms and posts within forms and hrefs and things like that. But they don't necessarily, they don't necessarily think about the actual wire organization until you really have to dig down, of course. So there is, that is a lot of the goal. That is not the entire goal of having some kind of formal IDL, but it is a lot of the goal, and that you can generate that and get that beautiful linkage between client and server. And it doesn't matter that you're Java and I'm PHP over here; they still come together in the middle there. And that lingua franca, that thing that brings us all together, is ultimately the IDL, which is language agnostic. WADL did a great job of that. Swagger's doing a great job of that. And that the Google basically API discovery system, part of the goal of that was the same idea, that it would be easy to auto-generate client-side stubs. And in fact, if you look at the Swagger stuff, they out of the box they've got a piece of code that'll auto-generate like ActionScript and JavaScript and Ruby and PHP but it's also open enough that you can extend that. So if you're writing in some extremely obscure client-side language, you can easily create the templates in that. I think they're using Antler for a bunch of that work. You can easily start to build out the ability to extend it, and I think that's actually can be a really good thing. Now that said, you still, in the end, you've got the versioning problem there, but you always do. Like anytime you have a client and a server, you've got that thing that you've got to worry about how to keep those two things in sync. And so I always say to the people on the server side, think about how you're going to manage the versioning problem, because it's very rare, and it doesn't matter whether your client developers are just hacking together the rest with strings, or they're using client steps or whatever. They've got a linkage, okay? They've got a lockstep kind of linkage with your APIs. So think about the fact that you're never going to be able to say, big bang, on Tuesday, everything's going to be version 2. You're always going to get people drifting and out of sync and things like that. So come up with a good versioning strategy at the beginning, and you better be ready to stand up multiple versions simultaneously, because you're going to have to say, okay, on Tuesday we're going to make version 2 available. Version 1.9 is going to be around for the next 18 months, before we eventually phase it out. And even then, you might say 18 months, but in fact, you give people a quiet grace period that you don't even talk about for maybe 24 or something like that. Because it's hard to change clients. Let's face it. It's easy to change servers. It's hard to change clients, and it's horrendous to change clients when they happen to be things like phones and mobile devices and stuff like that. It's only going to get worse. So think about the versioning problems.
Great. So just as people are kind of formulating their last questions, and maybe Scott's thinking about some final thoughts, I'll just mention that another 2 weeks, June 12th is our next Tech Talk, so we hope you guys can make it. We'll be talking API analytics, and it'll be the same thing Tuesday, June 12th, 9 a.m. PDT, noon on the East Coast, and again, API analytics. And also in the meantime, June 5th, we've got a webinar coming up, which is getting your API discovered, the secret to API promotion featuring programmable web. So you can hit the Layer 7 website, just layer7.com. You can find these things out on our Facebook page. It's just Facebook.com/Layer7, or through our Twitter feed, which is just @Layer7. Yeah, so if there aren't any final questions, we'll just wait a second and see if...
That's going to be a good one, by the way. John Moosers from Programmable Web is a really smart guy.
That's the webinar in June 5th.
Yeah, it's the next webinar coming out. So if I'm definitely going to check that one out, because I think there'll be some really interesting things. Because Programmable Web was really, when you look at it, was the pioneer in the idea of kind of what I would call the sort of the modern repository, that root, where not only is it the root of a particular system for discovery, it's the root of all roots, where you can just go down and discover APIs everywhere. And if there's the biggest difficulty there, of course, is the versioning problem. Is is stuff up to date and that? And so I'm sure he's going to have a lot of good things to say about that. Fascinating area, actually. They're solving that central directory problem that has never been solved before. People have talked about it for many years, but it really has been one of those holy grails. So that'll be a good one.
Yeah. So 2 dates to keep in mind. June 5th is the webinar. Getting your API discovered, engage and onboard third-party developers to maximize the value of enterprise APIs, featuring John Musser from Programmable Web. And then June 12th is the next Tech Talk, talking API analytics. So I just want to say thanks to everybody for coming. Great questions. David, I hope we answered all your questions. Jamie and Matt, appreciate that. Hussein, you were really quiet. So we expect to see you back on June 12th. And Scott, again, thanks very much.
Okay. Listen, thanks. It's always a pleasure. And anybody who wants to get a hold of me, by the way, just email me anytime, scott@layer7.com, SCOTT, 2 T's, or @Scott Morrison. So leading initial K, there's too many Scott Morrisons in the world, so I'm the K Scott Morrison. So @Scott Morrison.
Perfect. Thanks everybody for attending. We'll see you soon.